In Boston, a police call becomes deadly. The gunman escapes. But Boston police and the FBI vow to find him. Uncovering his past, they navigate a trail of criminal connections, false names, and hidden danger to make him pay for his brutal attack on the law.
A criminal who kills a police officer wages war on society. In 1987, such a criminal vanished after shooting 2 Boston officers, one fatally. He had a history of violence against cops and the protection of a group of outlaws as he fled across state and national borders. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Finding this elusive cop killer meant breaking his co-conspirators before he slipped away forever.
Boston, Massachusetts. The city's Back Bay district is an upscale area, unaccustomed to violent crime. At 12:30 a.m. on October 2nd, 1987, in one Back Bay apartment building, Meredith Falcone and her cousin were locked in an argument. He had threatened her and she was trying to get him to leave. She feared he wouldn't go away, but instead grow angrier. She called 911.
911, this call is recorded. What is your emergency?
The emergency operator dispatched 2 police vehicles to the scene. Within minutes, the first squad car arrived at the apartment building. It seemed a fairly routine call for officers George Torres and Chris Rogers. They rang Meredith Falcone on the intercom. But there was a problem with her front door release buzzer, according to Officer Torres.
She came over the speaker, the intercom, and stated to us that her buzzer doesn't work, to ring somebody else's to let us in. In the background, while she was talking, we could hear some commotion, so we knew that there was something going on inside the apartment.
Then 2 more officers, William Kennedy and Roy Sergi, arrived on the scene. So far, none of the tenants had responded to buzz them in. So the officers decided to split up.
We took the standard procedure that 2 of us would cover the back and 2 would stay in front. At that point, Officer Rogers and myself proceeded to the back.
Torres and Rogers searched for another way into the building.
We look into a little alcove behind the building, and we see a male up against the side of the wall, sort of trying to hide.
Perhaps it was the cousin the caller had mentioned.
I asked him to come towards me to find out what's going on.
The fence's gate was padlocked.
Over the fence.
I told him to climb over the fence towards my side. As he put his feet on the ground, he attempted to flee. At that point, I grabbed him and I started the pat-down procedure. Once I put my hands on his shoulders, he shoved me. Gut instinct told me that he had a gun.
Torres was hit. The man kept firing at Officer Rogers, then chased Torres. Rogers couldn't get a clean shot. By then, Kennedy and Sergi had come to the side. Officer Sergi had been shot too. Though injured, Torres tried to assist Roy Sergi. Kennedy chased the suspect for several blocks, but he had disappeared into the Boston night.
As I knelt over him and leaned over, I noticed that there was blood coming out of my left arm and the left side of my chest. And at that point, I knew that I was hit several times.
Rogers called for backup and emergency personnel.
I felt the pain, the burning sensation. I started to gasp for air a little. At that point, I knew that something had gone through my lung.
Boston Dispatch put out the call that all police dread hearing. Officers down. Every available unit responded. In a matter of minutes, the normally quiet Back Bay district was swarming with emergency vehicles. Both critically wounded, Officers Roy Sergi and George Torres were rushed to the hospital. Detectives interviewed Officers Rogers and Kennedy. They explained what happened and said the assailant was an Asian male about 30 years old, of average height and with a muscular build. The description of the gunman differed from that of Meredith Falcone's cousin, the man who had started the domestic disturbance in the building. Officer Kennedy, a trained sniper, felt certain he shot the gunman as he fled, but no blood was found in that area. The injured officers had sustained 3 bullet wounds each, including life-threatening chest wounds. They were losing blood fast. Medical personnel struggled to stabilize them for emergency surgery. At the crime scene, forensic technicians began processing the area where the gunfight took place. It was littered with shell casings, bullet fragments, and blood. Detailing the placement of each item would help reconstruct exactly who fired when. Blocks away, they recovered an ammunition clip from a handgun, believed to be dropped by the gunman. It was a 15-round clip from a 9mm Sig Sauer semi-automatic, and it was empty. If it was the gunman's, they hoped to find fingerprints or some other forensic evidence that might lead them to him. In the lab, they would lift one partial print, but it was not enough for any comparison. Police issued a citywide alert for the suspect. They searched all of the Back Bay district and beyond. But that night, they found no sign of the gunman. Sergeant Detective James Fong of Boston's D14 station was named lead detective.
When I first heard that Roy, Sergi, and Joe Torres were shot, I was actually really surprised and shocked that someone would shoot Boston police officers.
Though worried about his colleagues, Detective Fong still had to do his job.
The crime scene is still a crime scene regardless of whether a police officer or a civilian involved, and you have to take everything step by step.
He first wanted to determine where the assailant had come from. Then he might be able to identify him.
I had already been given information that the individual who was involved in the shooting had come out from the back gate. We then, myself and other officers, went and investigated that area.
Inside the gated fence, they noticed a large air conditioning unit. On closer inspection, Detective Fong discovered shoe prints on the cover of the unit.
The footprints that we recovered at the scene were something consistent with where the officers, George Torres and Christopher Rogers, said that they had seen the individual.
Directly above the air conditioner was a window from a third-floor hallway.
I believe the footprints got on the cover by an individual jumping from the third-floor window onto the air-conditioned cover.
This suggested that the suspect was likely connected to the building somehow. Detectives wanted to interview the roughly 60 residents of the building. Fong decided to start with those of Asian descent.
The assailant was an Asian male, and I tried to put two to two together, thinking that maybe he did come from that building and maybe he was related or did reside at that building.
A forensic artist had created a composite sketch of the suspect based on the officers' descriptions. But the residents didn't recognize the man. Although they had heard the commotion and gunshots the night before, they could offer little help.
I interviewed all of the Asian occupants that were known to have resided in that building at that time of this incident, and none of them were able to give me any good solid leads.
Other residents couldn't help either.
I spoke to most of the tenants, and they didn't even know the next door neighbor because of the fact that it's a short-term lease type apartment. They were only there for a few days, a few weeks.
It seemed a dead end. At the hospital, the wounded officers were in critical but stable condition. Investigators were frustrated they had no leads on the man who shot them. Then, 6 days after the shooting, detectives returned to the apartment building to check out a new lead.
We had received a call from the manager who stated to us that there was an Asian male that had lived there and that she forgot to tell us about, and that they had gone in to check on his well-being because they hadn't seen him for that week.
The manager believed the place had been abandoned.
Boston Police, search warrant.
The tenant's name was Mark Terra. He loosely fit the description of the gunman.
All clear?
Earl, can you come on inside here?
A building employee pointed out a box of ammunition they discovered when they had come in to check on Terra.
Can you take a picture of that and bag it?
Technicians collected the bullets, noting they were 9mm, the same caliber as the casings and fragments found at the crime scene. In the lab, the bullets would be compared against those used in the shooting. Detective Fong checked the space where a ceiling tile was moved to the side. It was clear, but something might have been hidden there before. The apartment was spare and neat, suggesting the tenant might have served time in the military or prison. The technicians scoured the entire apartment for additional evidence.
We recovered a number of items: clothing, personal effects, and ammunition, and fingerprints and hair samples.
But nothing indicated where Terra had gone. Checking the name, they learned Mark Terra had no police record. But Detective Fong got a copy of his rental contract. On it, Terra listed a previous address and phone number in San Francisco. Detective Fong called the number and spoke with a man named Leon Perry.
Hi, this is Detective Fong with the Boston Police Department.
Perry was reluctant to talk,
I'm calling relative to an investigation.
and he denied knowing Terra.
The individual that I spoke to was very evasive. In fact, I identified myself as a police officer with the city of Boston who was investigating a shooting of 2 police officers. The individual then became very defensive, stating to me that he did not want to help the police department.
Perry seemed suspicious, but police had nothing that connected him to the shooting. Fong had San Francisco police run a check on Perry, and they reported he had no local record there. Boston police received a copy of Mark Terra's California driver's license photo.
George, I'm going to show you some photos here.
They brought it to the one officer who got the best look at the shooter, George Torres.
This picture just jumped out right at me. And I stated to him, that's the guy that shot us. Anxiety and fear ran through my body. Anxiety knowing that we have an ID on the suspect, and fear because he's still out on the street.
With a suspect identified, the Boston police held a press conference 1 week after the shootout.
Based on the information available to me and to our investigators, which I cannot disclose, we have an unusually violent person, and quite frankly, it's scary.
They believed they knew who the gunman was. Now, they had to find him. In Boston, a shootout left 2 police officers critically wounded. Suspect Mark Terra had disappeared. Investigators discovered his last known address was in San Francisco and asked their counterparts in the Bay Area to help.
That'll be about it. Everybody has their assignments?
They sent the San Francisco police wanted posters of Terra and asked them to have their officers look out for him in case he returned there. After a morning roll call, Sergeant Greg Lynch checked the wanted poster clipboard.
On the clipboard was a flyer regarding a suspect who had shot 2 Boston police officers. I knew I had seen the individual, I just couldn't immediately place where I had seen him.
Then Sergeant Lynch remembered an off-duty incident that had occurred 6 weeks earlier. In August of that year, as he was leaving a movie theater with a friend, he had spotted a man on the street carrying a handgun.
My first thought was he may have been a police officer, but when I looked at him, the feeling I got is he was not a police officer, especially when he turned and he looked at me intently. After the light turned green, he walked across the street. I told my friend to go to the phone, dial 911, tell him who I was, where I was, and that I had a man with a gun.
Lynch's instinct told him the man was a criminal. He followed the man, though he couldn't stop him from driving away. Sergeant Lynch did get the man's Texas license plate number.
Once I realized that the man in the Boston flyer was the man I saw at the movie house, that's when I started my investigation in acquiring the information that I called in back in August, including the license plate number, and that came back to a David Tejera.
Though the suspect used the first name Mark in Boston, it was the same man. His record was clean, and his registration listed a post office box in Brownsville, Texas. Lynch forwarded the information to investigators in Boston. In turn, Boston police immediately contacted authorities in Brownsville and asked for their assistance. A detective from the Brownsville police checked the post office box and found the suspect's street address. He went to the apartment building where the suspect had lived. The detective showed the apartment manager a photo of the man known as Mark, or David Tejera. The manager recognized the photo, but he didn't know him by either of those names. He knew him as Ted Atsuki. Atsuki had moved out months ago, and the manager had no idea where he had gone.
If you think of anything else that can help me, please give me a call. Thank you very much.
The Brownsville detective ran a check on the name Ted Atsuki and learned that was the suspect's true name. The names Mark and David Terra were aliases. Atsuki had an extensive criminal record, including a 1979 Texas bank heist preceded by the armed takeover of a small-town police station. In March of 1979, Atsuki overpowered the two officers manning the Los Fresnos police station, then took out their communications center. With the police neutralized, he walked across the street and robbed the local bank of $70,000. Atsuki was eventually convicted of the robbery and served 7 years of a 15-year sentence in Leavenworth Prison. Within a year of his release, he was wanted again for violating parole by leaving the state of Texas.
Criminal investigations, please.
The Brownsville detective called Boston and offered to send Atsuki's fingerprints.
Brownsville, Texas. Got some information on a active case you got up there.
11 days had passed since the shooting of the officers in Boston, and the city was still on edge. By that time, police technicians there had lifted a single usable print from the suspect's rental contract. They compared it against Ted Atsuki's print sent from Texas. Checking comparison points, they made a match. Investigators were sure Atsuki was the gunman who had shot officers George Torres and Roy Sergi. They also believed he had left Massachusetts. Boston police contacted the FBI for assistance, and the case was assigned to Special Agent Jay Fallon of the Boston Field Office.
With the probable cause that he had fled the state to avoid being arrested, the FBI obtained an unlawful flight to avoid prosecution warrant.
Agents tracked down a known associate of Atsuki in the area and convinced him to cooperate.
That's what we're looking for. Okay.
He said he heard the suspect had come to Boston as part of a bank robbery plot.
Certainly first thing tomorrow morning, okay, as soon as I talk to that guy.
It was our belief that Ted Atsuki was in the Boston area in order to put together a collection of associates to formulate a plan by which they would identify and kidnap a bank official.
It appeared the shooting of the officers was completely unrelated, a tragic mistake. Investigators believed that on the night of the shootings, Ted Atsuki was in his apartment. Boston police arrived at the building in response to the domestic disturbance call.
I can't buzz you in. My buzzer doesn't work.
They believed Atsuki mistakenly assumed the officers were there to arrest him for violating his parole in Texas.
Boston PD, please let us in.
He grabbed his 9mm Sig Sauer and extra rounds of ammunition. When police buzzed asking for entry, Atsuki was ready to go. Police believed he jumped from a hallway window to the air conditioning unit below. Seconds later, the gunfight. Ted Atsuki was willing to do anything to escape. In 1987, Boston police and the FBI searched for Ted Atsuki, wanted for the shooting of 2 police officers. Special Agent Jay Fallon tried to narrow the search for the fugitive and predict his moves.
A very basic tenet in these type of investigations is to identify and interview the subject's friends and family and associates in an effort to determine any nuances insofar as what his likes, dislikes, where he might be.
They had contacted Leon Perry in San Francisco, whom they believed to be an associate. But he claimed not to know the fugitive. Surveilling Perry, they realized he was using Atsuki's car. They watched it, but never saw Atsuki. The FBI's database had revealed Leon Perry spent time in Leavenworth prison with Atsuki. When confronted, Perry admitted knowing the suspect, but said he had not spoken to him in months and had no idea where he was. They didn't have probable cause for an arrest, but they impounded the car and arranged for spot surveillance of Perry. When they searched his apartment, they found no sign of Atsuki. In Boston, the case took a tragic turn. The two wounded officers had been recovering well. But on October 26, 1987, Roy Sergi died suddenly when a blood clot lodged in his heart, causing cardiac arrest.
Detail! Bring the sand!
Sergeant Detective James Fong.
When I first learned that Roy had passed away, I was in complete shock. I had seen him 2 nights before, and he and I were engaged in small talk conversation. I remember Roy saying to me, I'll be seeing you guys upstairs, that being in the detective's room, working alongside with us upon his recovery. I made it a personal commitment to myself that we would seek out the individual that shot and killed Roy Sergi.
Ted Atsuki grew up in Texas and had family there. Hoping to find him, investigators interviewed his relatives in the area. They were shocked by the allegations and said they had not seen or heard from Atsuki in several months. They claimed they had no idea where he was. To confirm their story, investigators subpoenaed their phone records. They discovered several recent calls from the relative's home to Atsuki's former roommate Leon Perry in San Francisco. The records also revealed calls to a second ex-convict, a former bank robber in Minnesota. The FBI brought him in, and he agreed to turn informant. He gave more details about Atsuki's plan for hostage-taking, bank robbery, and murder. Atsuki had associates create remote-controlled briefcase bombs to be handcuffed to the wrists of kidnapped bank officials. After the officials removed cash from their own vaults, Atsuki and his men would detonate the bombs to eliminate witnesses.
Many times people come up with ideas which others might think of as being harebrained, but Ted Atsuki took the time to actually plan such an endeavor and enlisted the help of professionals that were very, very capable of constructing these bombs and very capable of invading a home and very capable of robbing a bank.
Agents needed to confirm the story.
He told us that these briefcase bombs were being stored in a storage facility in San Francisco, which Atsuki had rented under an assumed name.
The FBI and the San Francisco Police Bomb Squad found the storage locker. And inside, the briefcase described by the informant. Not knowing exactly how the device was triggered, they had to be cautious. The specialists placed the briefcase far from the storage building, then attached a small charge designed to open the case without detonating any bomb inside. It was a pipe bomb, an improvised device made volatile by gunpowder held under pressure. When sparked, the powder burns so intensely, it bursts the metal pipe walls, sending deadly shrapnel flying in all directions. To render it safe, they needed to open the pipe, releasing the pressure on the gunpowder. Using a water cannon is the safest way to do so, according to San Francisco FBI Special Agent Philip Senna.
The cannon slug is forced out by water under great pressure. That way you're not firing something that has heat and flame directed at the pipe. You're sending something that's relatively benign in the effort to uncap the explosive before it can explode. The device was very well constructed, quite sophisticated. It was designed to be placed and then detonated from a distance. I was told that the device was capable of killing somebody and having a relatively small blast radius, maybe 10, 15 feet, but being pretty devastating within that radius.
They later found and rendered safe a second bomb. The evidence was collected for processing at the forensics lab. Special Agent Fallon wanted to know if Atsuki's former San Francisco roommate, Leon Perry, knew about the bombs.
After the bombs were recovered, we re-interviewed Perry. Perry stated that he had no idea as to the existence of these bombs and certainly would have notified us if he did. We then sent the bombs and the materials to the lab, and we determined, the lab determined that, in fact, Perry's fingerprints were on the boxing materials that the bombs were in. Based on the fact that we truly didn't think that Perry was cooperating with us as completely as he could have and should have, we made the decision to revoke his parole and put him in jail.
Investigators had long suspected that Perry was actively involved with Atsuki. Now they had direct evidence. Unless he cooperated, Perry was facing a return to prison of up to 20 years. Special Agent Senna hoped to get him to talk.
We had enough evidence of his association with Atsuki and parole violation evidence that we had the ability to put a little pressure on him. He was comfortable in prison, so going back wasn't the worst possible thing that could have happened to him. We spent the first day probably 15 hours talking. And this went on for approximately a week, sometimes 10, 12, 14 hours. There were headache days.
Eventually, agents convinced Perry it was in his best interest to cooperate, and he began to talk. Perry said that on the day after the Boston shooting, he got a phone call in San Francisco.
He told us that Ted had called him, told him that things had gone bad in Boston.
Atsuki said he had shot 2 cops there and that he was shot too. He told Perry he was calling from the airport in Dayton, Ohio. Atsuki said he had to fly to Texas where he could quietly get medical attention for his gunshot wound. Atsuki had left his car and the gun he used in the shootout at the Dayton airport. He asked Perry to go to Ohio and get it. Perry agreed.
Ozuki sent the keys to the automobile and the long-term parking ticket, overnight mail. He was to go to Dayton, recover the car, take the murder weapon, and destroy it. Drive the car back to San Francisco, unload the rest of the stuff from the car, and hide it.
Perry found the car as Atsuki described. Inside was the 9mm Sig Sauer.
The murder weapon was a high-quality handgun. He was reluctant to destroy that high-quality handgun. So he decided that he would take the handgun and give it to his father.
He drove to his parents' house in Missouri and left the gun there.
We contacted the father. I spoke with him. I assured him that his son was doing the right thing. I asked him if he still had the handgun, and he said that he had.
Missouri agents retrieved the Sig Sauer. Ballistics testing confirmed it was the weapon that fired the fatal bullets.
Fingerprints were found to be on a bullet within the weapon that matched Ozuki. So now we not only had the weapon that ballistics showed had killed the police officer, but we also had Ozuki's fingerprints on one of the bullets in the weapon.
With physical evidence implicating Atsuki in the murder of Roy Sergi and in the building of deadly bombs, the FBI placed Ted Atsuki on their 10 most wanted fugitives list. But the dangerous fugitive had been on the run for 4 months. By now, he could be anywhere. In 1988, the FBI continued a nationwide manhunt for Ted Atsuki, a suspected cop killer. On January 22nd of that year, they placed him on their 10 most wanted fugitives list. To further the publicity of the case, the FBI asked a nationally televised crime show to profile Atsuki. During the broadcast, an acquaintance of Atsuki's called the show's toll-free number. When it seemed he had a legitimate tip, operators patched him through to FBI Special Agent Jay Fallon.
Jay Fallon.
The caller said that Atsuki was especially close with 2 particular relatives living in Texas, and that if anyone knew Atsuki's whereabouts, it was this couple. Authorities had previously spoken with the couple who claimed to have no contact with the fugitive.
If someone saw us at the birthday party, that's about it.
Checking the relatives' phone records, agents discovered a sudden increase in calls from Guadalajara, Mexico, where the family had other relatives. Atsuki might have fled there. The hunt extended into Mexico. FBI offices in foreign countries are called legal attachés. At the Mexico City legal attaché, FBI Special Agent Stephen Walker took on the case.
The FBI has no legal authority to conduct investigations on a foreign land according to the laws of that country. So we solicit, or the FBI would solicit, cooperation, form a liaison relationship, and request officially that the host country law enforcement agencies do the work of the FBI.
I have an investigation. It's very important.
Special Agent Walker met with the Mexican Federal Judicial Police to ask for their assistance in searching for Atsuki.
We didn't have an exact address in Guadalajara, but we did have some suspect telephone numbers in that area. And investigation conducted at that time failed to locate the relative or to locate Atsuki.
Special Agent Fallon hoped Atsuki's former roommate, Leon Perry, could help them. Offering Perry immunity on the bomb-making charges, the FBI convinced him to wear a wire.
We had devised a plan by which we thought that Perry could speak with family members of Ted Atsuki in an effort to have the family be forthcoming and advise Perry as to where Atsuki might be.
Agents created a fake passport for Perry and coached him on how to draw the relatives in.
Doesn't work nights and never works in Mexico.
Perry got this bogus identification and was going to leave town, so to speak. That was the story that he was going to tell Atsuki's family in an effort to have the family reach out to Atsuki to speak with Perry. There was also the situation as to the murder weapon, and one of the biggest selling points was that Perry needed to know from the family what Ted wanted done with the murder weapon before he fled.
Check your mic again. Wait.
After several requests, Atsuki's Texas relatives agreed to meet with Perry at a restaurant in Matamoros, Mexico. Outside, Boston Detective James Fong, FBI agents and Mexican Federal Police waited, ready to listen in on the meeting.
All right. Copy. Mike, sounds good. We're ready to go.
Okay.
Other agents were inside.
Prior to the arrival of Perry, myself and another agent had gone into the restaurant and sat down in an effort to observe and surveil the situation. Perry walked in, sat at the bar.
He didn't have to wait long before Atsuki's relatives walked in.
We're going inside, right here. How's it going?
Agents could hear them talking, but Atsuki was never mentioned. After a few minutes, Atsuki's male relatives said they needed to leave. The surveillance teams changed plans fast.
They're leaving. They're leaving. They're on the move.
I was concerned because that was not exactly what we were expecting.
Right now, we're going to do a movement surveillance.
However, you have to have faith in the people that you have out there.
We'll pick it up here, and then you can pick it up in a few minutes. They're coming up to you.
They would have to stay close enough to maintain the audio signal, but still avoid detection. They hoped they were finally closing in on Ted Atsuki.
We'll pick it up here, and then you can pick it up in a few minutes.
In northern Mexico, Detective James Fong and other investigators had wired an informant and followed him as he met with relatives of suspected cop killer Ted Atsuki. Surveillance teams had to stay close to maintain the signal from the microphone they had on informant Leon Perry.
Hey, listen, I need to meet with Ted. I need to talk with Ted.
It's gonna be tough, I'm telling you.
Well, where is he?
He's not anywhere around here.
If he wants me to take care of the things he wants me to take care of, I'm gonna have to meet with him. And I can't tell. I don't know how else to tell you that.
Okay, tell you what.
Finally, the relatives said they would call Atsuki.
My wife has a number. I think what we can do is to head over to the bus station.
The bus station?
They've got phones there.
Oh, okay.
And they may be able to
help us
Well,
connect to him.
Okay, well, do you think he'll meet with me after we talk to him?
He's not going to meet with you. He might talk to you over the phone, but that's about it.
The bus station was in the town of Matamoros, a few miles from the Texas border. Investigators watched as the relatives placed a call on a public long-distance telephone. Undercover agents kept a closer eye on them. The relatives spoke briefly, then gave the phone to Perry.
What's up?
It was Atsuki.
Where are you?
He told Perry to destroy the 9mm Sig Sauer. He said he'd been robbing banks in Mexico, but he wouldn't say exactly where.
All right, see you.
Still, the phone call was the best lead yet for Special Agent Philip Senna.
The Mexican federal authorities were able to get the phone number that was accessed from the clerks that run the bus station. The Federal Judicial Police were able to determine the location of that number in Guadalajara.
Working as a liaison with the Mexican Federal Police in Guadalajara was FBI Special Agent Stephen Walker.
We had the telephone number that was called. We knew it was Atsuki that was called. It was listed to a residence in Guadalajara, which turned out to be an apartment in the city. So it was just a matter then of going to Guadalajara, enlisting the services of the federal police to go to the apartment.
Teams of officers staked out the building, but there was no sign of Atsuki.
We were so close, but we didn't have him yet. So in some ways, it was more difficult than not knowing where he was, because now that we knew where he was, we wanted him desperately, and we didn't know if we were going to be able to accomplish that.
Then, 2 days after the stakeout began, Ted Atsuki appeared. The officers moved in. Atsuki drew a gun, but didn't get a shot off this time. The federal police arrested him, then transferred custody to the FBI the next day. Ted Atsuki was found guilty of the attempted murder of George Torres and the first-degree murder of Roy Sergi. He was sentenced to life plus 20 years. Officer Torres recovered from his wounds and returned to active duty. He retired from the Boston Police Department in 1997. Roy Sergi, promoted to detective after the shooting, left behind a wife and 3 children and scores of friends on the Boston police force. The community room at the D14 police station is dedicated to his memory. George Torres hopes the legacy of the case helps keep other officers alive.
We try not to take anything as a routine call. There's no such thing as a routine call. You go there, expect the unexpected.
After the shooting, Boston police began issuing bulletproof vests to all officers and replaced their 6-shot revolvers with 15-round semi-automatics. Now they stand a better chance at coming out alive when the unexpected happens. In Miami, a young man is abducted at gunpoint. The kidnappers demand a fortune and threaten to kill. The police and FBI uncover disturbing leads and look for answers in the smallest clues in a desperate race to find the victim and bring him home to his family.
kidnapping can shatter a family, bringing terror and heartache without warning. In 1984, with the flash of a gun, an ordinary business transaction became a violent abduction. In seconds, the son of a wealthy Miami developer was gone. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. The kidnapper's motivations seemed to be money, but agents would learn this case and its resolution were more complicated than anyone believed.
Miami, Florida, Tuesday, August 7th, 1984. At 6 o'clock, the sales office of real estate developer Jesus Portela was closing. Mr. Portela had emigrated from Cuba 22 years earlier, building a successful business in Miami. His 22-year-old son, Mario, was recently married and worked as a salesman for his father, as did Mario's uncle. A little after 6, a couple approached the office. Mario and his uncle went out to talk with him. The couple asked about condo prices. The man seemed anxious as they spoke. The uncle explained that the office had closed. He asked them to return in the morning. At the couple's request, he went inside to get some brochures for them. He didn't see what was happening outside. An armed man had pulled up, and the three were abducting Mario. The uncle spotted temporary tags on the car, but only got the last 3 numbers. He told Jesus what he saw. Mario, forced into a blue and gray car, heading north on 122nd Avenue. Then he called the police. But Mario's father couldn't wait for the police to arrive. He went looking for his son. Soon he spotted a car matching the description of the kidnapper's vehicle. For years, he had carried a licensed gun for protection. Now, he was ready to use it. But it was the wrong car. Realizing he couldn't find the kidnappers himself, Jesus returned to wait for the authorities. The Metro-Dade police responded to the kidnapping call. For Detective Alvaro Romero, abductions were not unusual in 1984.
At that time, we were inundated with kidnappings. We had probably 1 kidnapping a month related to narcotics or drug-related kidnappings, where the victims would either be involved in drugs themselves or possibly family members were involved in drug dealings.
But detectives quickly realized Mario's abduction was different.
Questioning Mr. Portela and recognizing the fact that he was a prominent businessman in the community led us to believe that it was not narcotics related and strictly a financial gain for the people who kidnapped his son.
It meant anybody who knew of Mr. Portela's wealth could be a suspect. Hoping the kidnappers left some trace behind, crime scene technicians dusted the door for fingerprints. Mario's uncle believed they might have touched it as they peered inside. No usable prints were found. Less than an hour after the kidnapping, the phone rang.
Hello? See?
Speaking in Spanish, the caller asked for Mario. Mr. Portela didn't recognize the voice.
No. ¿Quién habla?
The caller then announced he was part of a terrorist group that was holding Mario for $3 million in ransom. Although no recording equipment was in place, a Spanish-speaking detective listening in identified the caller's accent as Colombian. The caller threatened to kill Mario if Jesus notified police or the FBI, and warned that the group was watching the Portela house and gave the address. The distraught father pleaded to speak with his son.
Hello?
The kidnapper announced he would call Jesus's home in 3 days.
Hello?
Police could not trace the call, but it helped them understand the type of criminal they were facing.
We felt the kidnappers were very violent. They took precautions as far as the phone calls that they were making, and they were very serious in their threats. They knew what they were doing, and we took them very seriously.
As with any kidnap for ransom, Metro-Dade police called the Miami field office of the FBI for assistance, and the case went to Special Agent John Gill.
The FBI was involved from the very onset. The very fact that a large ransom was demanded caused it to fall into the jurisdiction of what we call the Hobbs Act.
The Hobbs Act makes extortion affecting interstate commerce a federal crime, and Mr. Portela's business reached across state lines. Agents from the FBI's reactive squad installed recording equipment on Mr. Portela's office and home phones, and arranged to have all incoming calls traced. The next day, Special Agent Gill wanted to talk with Jesus Portela, but not at the trailer or at home. He asked Jesus to meet him at an empty garage. Agents watched the entrances and exits of the garage for any sign of the kidnappers, but did not see anyone. As far as they could tell, it was safe for Gill to question Mr. Portela.
Portela. Yes. My name is John Gill. Your credentials, sir. I have been assigned the administrator of this kidnapping case.
The agent asked if Mr. Portela knew of anyone who had a grudge against him, or if he had ever been threatened. The worried father could think of only one minor incident. He said that 8 months earlier, a man and woman burst into his office. He knew the woman. Her name was Rose de Parias. She recently purchased a condominium from him and said she discovered her neighbor's payments were lower than hers. Mr. Portela explained that the difference was because the neighbor had obtained a better finance rate. It was between the buyer and the bank.
The payments were not made to him at all. The financier had paid for the condominium, and he was out of the picture, so to speak.
The two refused to accept the explanation. The man began threatening him, demanding that Portela refund the money. But there was nothing he could do. Before they left, Rose de Parias vowed she would get her money back, one way or another. Mr. Portela had reported the incident to police.
And the police talked to this particular woman and explained to her the circumstances of financing and interest payment, and she apologized, and Mr. Portela just assumed that this had all gone away.
Agents later tracked down Rose de Parias and learned she was living in another state during the kidnapping. When they confirmed her alibi, they ruled her out as a suspect. Investigators were getting worried. With each day that passes, the chances of finding a kidnapping victim alive drastically diminish. They hoped the kidnappers would call again.
And the victim, we've got a victim.
If they did, the reactive squad was prepared, having wired Jesus Portella's home and office with telephone tap and trace equipment.
Meet at his office, right? All right, I'll be there.
Special Agent Gil Orantia and other investigators needed to be there to monitor the calls and run the equipment. But getting into the home unseen would be tricky.
The initial calls and our indications were that they were watching his home, they being the kidnappers. We were concerned that they might be able to detect that I was coming in.
They needed Mr. Portella's help.
I was crouched in the back seat as we drove to his home. We went into the garage and then we went into the house. We wanted to be able to record the phone calls and be able to capture everything that was said to him regarding any ransom demands.
Agents and Metro-Dade detectives would take shifts, staying with the Portella family 24 hours a day. They briefed Jesus on how to handle the calls. He would be the lead in the effort to get his son back.
One of the things early on, obviously, was to determine if he's even alive or not. And we discussed with Mr. Portella some of the things that he could ask the kidnappers, which only Mario Portella would know, proof of life questions, if you would, that could come back to us to verify, yes, we know he's alive.
In building a profile of Mario, with details about his life, including favorite foods and names of pets, the agents got to know the young man.
Mario Portella was the all-American kid. He had gone to school. He had maintained outstanding grades. He had just gotten married to a young lady, and they were newlyweds with a bright future. Everybody loved him. The reason that this case was so traumatic for so many people is that so many people could identify with them. They were the type of family that we all aspire to be, and they were living the American dream, but they ran into a nightmare.
As promised, the kidnappers called 3 days after the abduction. The caller ordered Mr. Portella to listen to a taped recording. The voice on the tape was Mario. He pleaded with his father to pay the ransom money, warning the kidnappers were serious and would kill him if he called the police or the FBI. Jesus told the caller he had discreetly begun the process of securing the money from his bank. Agents reminded Mr. Portella to ask the proof of life questions, including what Mario's nickname was as a child and the name of the dog his wife used to have. The man agreed to call back with the answers. Mr. Portella had kept him on the line long enough for agents to trace the call to a Miami payphone. But the caller had gone before surveillance units arrived. In the harrowing days after the kidnapping, Mr. Portella received several other calls. Speaking in Spanish, a different man talked vaguely and mysteriously of a business proposition apparently unrelated to the abduction.
The demeanor of Mr. Portella at the time was, I really don't have time to talk to you about business because I have other problems. This individual indicated on several calls that he, in fact, was a person that could help solve the problems. His persistence in trying to communicate his involvement in whatever Mr. Portella's problem was caused us to be highly suspicious that somehow he was playing a role or a part in the kidnapping or the ransom demands.
Jesus kept the man on the line, and investigators pinpointed the source of the call. It was coming from the same area as the kidnapper's earlier call. Surveillance units made it to the scene in time to spot the person on the phone. They followed him to a fast food restaurant, where he emerged with a takeout bag. From their biographical profile of Mario, investigators knew the restaurant's burgers were his favorite. They then followed the man to an apartment complex, where his behavior was even more suspicious.
When he took the hamburgers to an apartment and delivered them through the door, having no conversation with the recipient, and this was the brand of hamburgers that Mario and his father fancied, yes, at that point we were suspicious that perhaps Mario was being held at that location.
The SWAT team responded and set up outside the apartment. The clock was ticking. They needed to find Mario. In Miami, the FBI and Metro-Dade police were trying to find Mario Portela and whoever kidnapped him. Their first good lead brought them to a Miami apartment where they believed the kidnappers might be holding Mario. The SWAT team quickly secured the apartment and searched each of its rooms. But Mario was not there. It had been a false lead for FBI Special Agent John Gill.
It was determined not only by search, but interview of the people there that they were not related or associated with the kidnapping whatsoever.
Interviewing the caller, agents determined he knew nothing of the abduction and was merely trying to get work with Mr. Portela's company. Investigators again were forced to wait for the kidnappers to make the next move. It was the original caller. He answered the proof-of-life questions correctly, suggesting Mario might still be alive.
That's correct.
And again demanded $3 million. As instructed, Jesus tried to keep the caller on the line. He said he had spoken to the bank and could only come up with 1/3 of the amount. As Mr. Portela negotiated, agents traced the call to another Miami payphone. Units were on their way. Eventually, the caller agreed to $1 million. Trying to stall longer, Mr. Portela said it would take time to get the money, since the bank was closed for the night. But the man ordered him to have it ready when he called back in 3 hours, with instructions for the drop. Once again, he disappeared before authorities could arrive. Within the hour, Mr. Portela met plainclothes agents at his bank.
Looks like it's all here. You go ahead and sign for it.
There, the FBI recorded the serial numbers of the bills that made up the $1 million ransom, so they could be traced when the kidnappers spent them.
Good. Okay, gentlemen?
Yes?
Thank you. Thank you.
At the Portela home, agents hid a tracking device in the briefcase, hoping it would lead them to wherever Mario was being held.
Yes. Speaking.
The kidnappers called on schedule and gave Mr. Portela directions for the ransom drop. They ordered him to drive to a local restaurant, leave the car door unlocked with the money inside, wait for a call at a certain payphone, then go into the restaurant and sit down. The caller warned Jesus to go alone. With the loaded briefcases, Jesus began the trip. It took less than half an hour, but to the worried father, it must have seemed an eternity. The restaurant was in a tough and dangerous part of Miami. Undercover agents and Metro-Dade detectives were already there, watching. Agents also manned an empty apartment with a view of the restaurant. Jesus Portela arrived, carrying $1 million in cash and hoping finally to get his son back. But he would soon discover that nothing was as the kidnappers said it would be. Jesus Portela was on his way to deliver $1 million ransom in an unsafe part of Miami, hoping to get his son Mario back. The way he handled the troubling and dangerous situation impressed the investigators working with him, including FBI Special Agent Gil Orantia.
For him to have endured what he did, I have all the respect for him in the world. He performed very, very well. He did the things we asked him to. He did things that probably most of us couldn't do.
The FBI and Metro-Dade police had undercover personnel staking out the restaurant. But the place was closed, and Jesus began to wonder if it was a setup. He found a payphone, though not where the kidnappers said it would be. He was nervous about leaving his car unlocked with $1 million in it. He hoped the kidnappers would call before anything happened to him. If thieves made off with the money, he might never see his son again.
Waiting for a phone call, is that all right? Hopefully this thing cut to be around this area. Well, I'm waiting for a phone call. Don't you have something better to do? Or a phone call? Keep going on.
Though he waited, the phone call never came. Eventually, Jesus had to leave with the ransom money, but without Mario. He and the investigators spent days waiting for the kidnappers to call again with new instructions.
There were no ransom calls that came after the drop failed. We were concerned at that point because obviously our only connection to them were the phone calls. That was our connection to the bad guys. That was our ability to do something about what they were doing. And when they stopped calling, we became very worried.
Although the kidnappers were not leaving new clues with ransom calls, older clues were beginning to pay off. FBI Special Agent John Hanlon was trying to find the car used in Mario's abduction. It was an older blue and gray four-door Chevrolet sedan and had temporary dealer tags, which were not in DMV databases at the time.
And of course, with a paper tag, it can't be traced, so the car looks perfectly legitimate and doesn't draw the attention of law enforcement.
Hanlon knew used car dealerships sometimes illegally rented cars that were for sale, placing temporary tags on them. He began phoning every dealership in the area. The time-consuming work paid off when Hanlon spoke to a clerk at one dealership in Miami.
I asked her, you rent any old cars? And she said, sure, you know, any old with paper tags? And she said, yeah. And I said, any old Chevys? She said, yeah. I asked her, I said, any blue and gray ones? She said, yeah. I says, where is it? She says, it's here. And I said, well, when was it rented? And she says, August the 7th. And I'm thinking, oh my God.
August 7th was the day of the kidnapping. When agents discovered the car had been returned the next day, they impounded it to have it searched for evidence. Metro-Dade forensics technicians processed the vehicle. They found no usable hair, fiber, or fingerprint evidence. But they did find a keychain under the back seat. The FBI knew that Mario Portela drove a Volvo.
So we barreled back over there, picked up the keys. We showed them to the family members. Of course, they identified them. It also fit his automobile, and we took it by the house, and the house key fit his home.
It meant that vehicle was most likely used to abduct Mario Portela. Checking records, agents learned a woman named Julita de Parias had rented the car. The clerk at the dealership said the woman came in with a man she said was her brother. Hanlon requested driver's license photos of Julita de Parias and her siblings. 9 days after the abduction, Hanlon met with the clerk who had rented out the car, showing her a photo lineup that included a picture of Julita de Parias, along with several decoy pictures. The clerk identified Julita de Parias immediately.
Are you sure? Positive. Okay, let me ask you, would you look at it? I mean, you had seen this individual before, I'd like you to take a look at it.
The clerk also identified the man who was with her. It was Julita's brother, Julio. Agents were familiar with the De Parias name. They remembered Rose De Parias was the woman who had had the dispute with Mr. Portela the previous year. Julita was Rose's sister. They now believed Julio De Parias was the man who accompanied Rose and threatened Jesus. Although the FBI still ruled out any involvement by Rose De Parias, her siblings were now prime suspects.
Once we had good suspects in this investigation, we put surveillance on some of the members in an attempt to gather more evidence.
The FBI noticed an unidentified man usually accompanied Julita. The couple seemed to be romantically involved. It had been 10 days since the abduction. Agents hoped the suspects would lead them to Mario Portela. They needed to question them, but doing so would alert any accomplices and put Mario's life at risk.
We couldn't exactly jump them at that moment because we were trying to rescue this young man. That was our primary objective, to get this young man back to his family. So we continued to watch them.
The FBI and Metro-Dade's surveillance effort included air and ground units. But the suspects seemed to be wary of a tail.
They were very erratic and paranoid in their behavior. Their driving would go in one direction and make a U-turn and go in another direction and then go through a parking lot and then in another direction, which was very taxing on our ability to surveil, in as much as you only have a limited number of automobiles to conduct a surveillance, and when you're passing by the same subject 3 and 4 times in the course of one trip, the chances of being identified as a surveilling vehicle are great.
The suspects' counter-surveillance techniques worked. Following them exhausted the helicopter's fuel supply, forcing agents to turn back. Ground units tried to remain undetected and keep the suspects in sight, but soon they lost them. It was a difficult blow to the investigation. 3 days later, and 25 miles north of Miami, in the town of Davie, Florida, 2 teenagers were walking in a field when they made a grim discovery that would provide terrible answers to a family hoping for the best. 13 days after Mario Portela was kidnapped, teenagers discovered a body in Davie, Florida, 25 miles north of Miami. Davie police realized it was a murder. The man's head was completely wrapped with duct tape. Detective Ed Taylor faced the challenge of identifying the victim.
All we knew at that time was it was a male. We didn't know how old he was because his entire head had been taped. His hands had been taped behind his back and his ankles had been taped together as well. So at the scene, we really didn't have very much information as to the identity of the victim or how old he was or anything of that nature.
They needed to examine the body, tape, and sleeping bag for more clues and remove the evidence to the controlled environment of the lab. Dr. James Ongley, then Associate Medical Examiner for Broward County, performed the autopsy. He removed the duct tape surrounding the head, careful to preserve each tear and section for later analysis by forensics technicians. With the tape off, Dr. Ongley could describe the victim as male, between the ages of 20 and 40, 5 foot 9 inches tall, with brown eyes and brown hair. Although the victim had been severely beaten, the cause of death was asphyxiation. He believed the man had been dead for 24 to 36 hours. To aid in identification, Dr. Ongley photographed the victim for comparison with photos of missing persons. But he knew the pictures would not be accurate representations of the victim. The tightly wrapped duct tape had distorted facial features, and the summer heat caused significant decomposition.
We took fingerprints from the victim so we could submit them to other departments to see if he had ever been arrested before. We did a press release to the various newspapers with a description of the victim and ran a photograph of the victim to see if anyone could identify him.
On August 25th, a Miami newspaper ran an article about the body found in Davie. FBI Special Agent John Gill noted the description loosely matched that of Mario Portela and immediately contacted the Davie Police Department about the abducted man.
We had received prior dental records of Mario Portela from his family dentist. And those records were in evidence at the FBI office in the event that they were needed to identify a victim. Those records were brought to Davie, Florida. I met with Detective Taylor, and we both proceeded then to the Broward County Medical Examiner's office. Dr. Ongley was then capable, with his experience, to take those dental films or x-rays and compare them to the body and positively identify that body as being our victim, Mario Portela.
For everyone trying to bring Mario home to his family, the news was devastating.
We had to notify the Portela family that the victim had been identified and deceased.
Now agents were investigating a murder. Reviewing the complex case, they outlined their suspects. Julio de Parias, the man who had threatened Jesus Portela the previous year. His sister Julita, whose name appeared on the rental contract for the abduction vehicle. And the man agents believed to be her boyfriend. All three had disappeared. Agents also developed another suspect, Hector de Parias, Julio and Julita's brother. He was close to his siblings and had a criminal record. Now, with no chance of finding Mario alive, the FBI's investigation could be overt. They interviewed the sister of 3 of the suspects, Rose de Parias, who had threatened Jesus Portela 8 months before the kidnapping. She denied any involvement and offered her full cooperation. She said Julita's boyfriend was Jesse Ramirez, and that if he and the others could not be found in Miami, they most likely went to Los Angeles, where they had friends. Miami agents forwarded the lead to the Los Angeles field office. There, Special Agent Gregory Pack knew they had no time to lose.
It was imperative to find these people as soon as possible because they are dangerous people, and they are people you don't want on the streets in your city or anybody else's city. If they did this once, kidnapped and murdered, what's to say that they wouldn't do it a second time to some other victim?
Special Agent Pack needed to narrow the scope of the search. He knew the suspects were of Colombian descent, and LA's Rampart district had a large Colombian population.
I went out there with these very good photographs, and I went to all the places that you and I would have to go to occasionally in a normal course of living. Dry cleaners, restaurants, hotels, motels, apartments. After a couple of weeks of this door-to-door canvassing, I ran across a lady who was the apartment manager. I showed her the photographs.
She recognized Hector, Julita, and Julio de Parias as new tenants, but said they seemed to be rarely at home.
So I left my card with her and asked her if she would call me. And I called her at least once a day. This went on for probably 8 or 10 days. Finally, in the evening, about 9 o'clock, I received a call from the office, and this apartment manager was on the line and wanted to be patched through to me. So I accepted the call, and she told me that the people that I had been looking for were in the apartment now. We approached the apartment house, took up various positions so there wouldn't be any escape out the windows or other doors. And as we ran in the front door, there was a gentleman pointing a revolver at us. So we tackled him, wrestled the gun from him, took him into custody, and then there was another person there.
The man with the gun was Julita's boyfriend, Jesse Ramirez. He was held on charges of assaulting a federal officer. The other man in the room was Hector de Parias, Julita and Julio's brother. He was held on a parole violation for drug possession and burglary. 2 suspects were in custody, but 2 were still at large.
We knew Julita and Julio were still outstanding. So when we left, I had 2 agents remain at the apartment. Several hours later, Julita came back. She was taken into custody, and then she was brought down to FBI headquarters in Los Angeles.
Agents waited for Julio de Parias, but he never showed. The case agent in Miami, John Gill, learned of the arrests.
Gregory Pack, the special agent in the Los Angeles division, called our division here in Miami. I was immediately on an airplane the morning of the telephone call, met with Agent Pack at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Los Angeles, where I briefed him on our experience and knowledge of the case.
Jesse Ramirez and Julita de Parias refused to talk to investigators. But Special Agent Gill and Davie, Florida Police Detective Ed Taylor had more success with Hector de Parias. They needed his help to find the 4th suspect, Julio de Parias. And they needed to know the details of Mario Portella's last days. On September 24th, 1984, the FBI apprehended 3 suspects in the kidnapping and murder of Mario Portella. But a 4th suspect, Julio de Parias, was still at large. Only one of the 3 in custody, Hector de Parias, agreed to talk. Still, he was evasive at first, and investigators caught him in several lies. Davie Police Detective Ed Taylor and FBI Special Agent John Gill decided on the soft approach to get the truth.
We befriended him in this style of interrogation, realizing that the potential was there to develop trust and cause him to, in a sense, confess.
So that we know
on the second day of interrogation, he became cooperative to the point that he was right on the edge of divulging his criminality. Tell me, Hector. As he became more trustful of Mr. Taylor and I, he advised us that, yes, he would cooperate and divulge details. He was not involved in the abduction, but several days after the abduction, Mario was being held captive in an apartment. The brother, sister, and the sister's paramour discovered that maintaining guard on a kidnapped victim is a lot of trouble, and they needed help. And they knew that Hector was available, that he was unemployed, that he was addicted to marijuana, could not get a job, and in fact would jump at an opportunity to participate in a venture with financial gain. So they solicited his help to watch a victim, as he put it.
According to Hector, the motive for the kidnapping was actually revenge. Julio de Parias felt humiliated that he could not force Mr. Portela to refund his sister's money after she purchased her condominium. Hector said that after several days, his brother Julio and Jesse Ramirez worried about getting caught and gave up on trying for a ransom. They decided they had to get rid of the only link to them, Mario Portela. So on August 17th, 1984, 10 days after the kidnapping, they decided to murder him. Jesse Ramirez began wrapping Mario Portela's head with duct tape as he pleaded for his life and prayed. As Mario struggled to breathe, Jesse beat him with a metal bar. After the murder, Julio de Parias paid Jesse Ramirez $1,000 for the job. Hector claimed to have no idea of Julio's whereabouts, but he did know where Mario was held and murdered.
Hector not only was able to give us an address of an apartment complex and the building unit, Hector was even able to draw us a diagram of the interior of the apartment, where the various rooms were, furniture, where the murder had taken place.
A team of agents, detectives, and forensics technicians rushed to the apartment in Miami. They secured it as a crime scene and processed it for clues. Any evidence recovered might help put Mario's killers behind bars. But seeing it brought back to investigators the disappointment of not being able to save the young man's life. Special Agent Gil Orantia was there.
As we entered this apartment, we saw a roll of duct tape on the side of a nightstand. We saw a bar that we believe was used to strike Mario with. We saw blood in the apartment. We saw all of these things that sort of put this thing, for us, evidentiary-wise, together. But it was a difficult thing to look at. It was a situation where, you know, our goal was to do the right thing and get him saved, and we couldn't do it. And it was tough. It was tough for us to look at that.
In addition to duct tape, investigators found pieces of adhesive medical tape in the room. They also recovered hair and fiber evidence. Everything was cataloged and sent to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for analysis. There, Special Agent Hal Dedman of the FBI's Trace Evidence Unit analyzed the items.
My involvement in the case dealt with the comparison of hairs, textile fibers, and tape from the 4 locations: the body recovery site, the apartment where the victim was held, a car that the body was transported in, and another apartment where clothing from one of the suspects was recovered.
He matched carpet fibers from those locations to samples found on the suspects and the victim. He also compared the tape wrapped around the victim's head, arms, and legs to the rolls of tape recovered at the murder scene.
If you have 2 pieces of tape that were once original or adjoining sections of the same piece of tape, and that tape is torn, the yarns are not all going to have the same appearance, they're not going to have the same length. You'll have short pieces and long pieces. And you can fit these pieces of tape together much like you'd fit pieces together in a jigsaw puzzle.
Special Agent Dedman determined the tear on the roll of tape from the apartment was a perfect fit with a piece of tape recovered from the victim's head. He also compared the tears on a strip of medical tape found on suspect Jesse Ramirez's shoes to those on the roll of medical tape found in the apartment and to those on a piece from the victim's body. It was another exact match.
Each piece of evidence contributed, and the result was that there was a tremendously strong association between the suspects in this case and the victim.
Jesse Ramirez and Julita de Parias were found guilty on kidnapping, extortion, and murder charges. Both were sentenced to life in prison. Hector de Parias pleaded guilty to the same charges and received 40 years. But the fourth suspect, Julio de Parias, was still out there.
We believed that he could have fled to Latin America somewhere. So we printed up wanted flyers that you'd find in your post office, in police departments. We sent them all over the place, and we developed the same ones in Spanish, and we distributed them throughout Latin America.
Almost 4 years after the kidnapping, in November of 1988, the FBI learned Costa Rican customs officials were holding a man who resembled the photo of Julio de Parias in the FBI's wanted poster. Special Agent Orantia flew to Costa Rica. The man did look like the photo, but it was his voice, the one from the ransom calls, that tipped Orantia off.
I had listened to those phone calls over and over and over again, hundreds of times. I knew that voice. That voice was a part of me as much as anything's a part of me. So at the moment he opened his mouth, that was it. That was it. It cinched it. I knew it was him.
The federal trial of Julio de Parias began 5 years to the day after Mario Portella's abduction. He was convicted of kidnapping, extortion, and murder, and sentenced to life. For the FBI agents who had gotten to know the victim's family, the convictions were important, but not the ending they had expected.
This was a horrendous crime. For some type of justice not to come out of it would have been difficult for the community in Miami and for the family, and I'll be honest with you, for us too, the agents. So I think the idea that some type of justice occurred is paramount. That's the only thing we can cling to, all of us, that at least they were caught.
The Portella family has persevered. They will never forget Mario, and they have not given up their dream.
Get on your knees, get on your knees.
In South Carolina, a family is taken hostage as part of a brazen bank robbery. Police track down the suspects, but they can't seem to keep the leader in jail. The FBI and police in 4 states are determined to stop him, but the armed fugitive is relentless in his struggle to stay free.
When a bank teller arrived at her parents' home, the gunmen were already there. The robbers held her family hostage and forced her to empty a bank vault. If she didn't comply, she could lose everyone she loved. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Even when authorities caught the crime's mastermind, they couldn't hold him. Soon he was back in action, with the FBI once again on his trail.
The Savannah River marks the state line separating Augusta, Georgia, from North Augusta, South Carolina. On the South Carolina side, on a Friday afternoon in October 1995, Parker and Brenda Shaw returned home with their granddaughter, Brianna. They watched Brianna on Friday afternoons when her mother, Amy Shaw, worked late as a bank teller. Parker tried to open the garage, but the remote door opener wasn't working. Not knowing someone was there, he went in the house to open the garage from inside.
Shut the door. Shut the door. Get down there. All right, all right.
The two intruders quickly bound Parker with duct tape,
Put your hands up front of you. That's good. That's good.
then forced him into the bedroom. Outside, Brenda got tired of waiting. With Brianna, she began to walk towards the front door. When the garage finally opened,
Come on, lady, let's go inside. This ain't no game, lady. Let's go. I ain't playing with you. Let's go. Come on, move it. Move it. Let's go. Come on. Upstairs, lady. Let's go. Let's go.
the man forced Brenda into the bedroom where her husband was being held by the other two intruders.
Look, lady. Cooperate. Nobody get hurt, okay?
The gunman stole money and credit cards from the frightened couple. But then the one who was clearly the leader announced he had really come for the Shaw's daughter, Amy, and the money at her bank. They would wait for her. The armed intruders held the Shaws for more than an hour.
Oh, lady, back. Sit down. Sit down.
At 7 p.m., the lead gunman ordered Brenda into the living room,
All right. Okay.
leaving one of his men to guard her husband and granddaughter. At the front window, they watched for Amy. They knew exactly when she was to arrive. For Amy Shaw, it was an ordinary Friday evening. The gunman ordered Brenda to the front door. Usually it was unlocked, so Amy was surprised she couldn't get in. She knew right away something was wrong.
Get over there. Get over there.
The leader grabbed Amy. He told her he had been watching them for some time. He knew their schedules, when they were vulnerable, everything. He began interrogating Amy about the security system at the bank.
And do you have them? Do you have the code?
From her training, she knew it was best to comply with the demands.
Is it on the timer? Is the ball on the timer?
There's no time.
She said she could get him into the bank, but it took 2 codes to open the vault, and she only had 1.
You ready? All right, don't try anything funny. All right, turn around.
He said they'd deal with that when they got there, and warned her if anything went wrong, her family could get hurt.
Okay. All right. Okay,
The leader
set up.
announced he was taking Amy to the bank and told his men to wait for his call.
You guys got everything under control. Any false moves, take care of them. Let's go. Come on.
Sorry.
Her parents and little girl could only hope that she would not be harmed. As they left, the kidnapper removed his mask to avoid looking suspicious in public. At gunpoint, Amy drove across the Savannah River from South Carolina into Georgia and to the bank where she worked. The gunman ordered her to circle the bank slowly so he could check if a cleaning crew was inside. Pulling up next to the automated teller machine, Amy hoped to catch the kidnapper's image on its security camera. Deciding it was clear, he ordered her to drive to the back door. He told her that when they got inside, she was to explain all of her actions so he would know she wasn't setting off any alarms, and warned her again not to make any mistakes. Inside, she showed him the alarm she could disable. But as she had explained, she could not open the main vault door alone. She had one combination, but a co-worker had the other. The kidnapper reminded Amy that her family would remain safe only if he could get inside the vault.
Get to the phone.
At the Shaw residence, the intruders moved the family to the living room where they could watch the front. The Shaws hoped it would end peacefully, but the men seemed to grow agitated, their guns at the ready. The handgun had gone off accidentally. The intruders worried the sound had alerted neighbors. And their concern mounted as another car pulled up to the house.
Somebody's coming. Get over by the door.
It was Amy's brother-in-law and sister, and their young daughter arriving for a visit.
Mom.
They were taken as soon as they entered the house.
Here we go. Let's go, lady. Come on. Come on. No, tie him up over there.
The gunman now had 6 hostages. At the bank, the lead assailant ordered Amy to call her co-worker for the second combination.
Hello? This is Amy.
When Amy asked, the co-worker hesitated, not understanding what was happening. Amy tried to explain that her family was being held hostage.
Get me the combination.
The gunman took over, threatening to come get the code himself.
Okay, just calm down.
Fearing for Amy's safety, the co-worker gave her the second combination. The gunman made sure the woman stayed on the line so she couldn't call police. Amy nervously punched in the second part of the combination. But the vault remained locked.
You gave me the wrong combination. Make it work or else.
She carefully tried again. And the door opened.
Get the phone.
The robber had Amy make sure the co-worker stayed on the line.
Which one of the dot packs?
And he ordered her to point out which bins held bait money that was sequentially numbered or rigged with exploding die packs. He left that cache alone. After the robber loaded up the money, he ordered Amy to call her parents' home on a second line.
Come on, get up, get the phone.
The leader ordered his men to take care of things at the house, then leave and page him when they were clear.
And get out.
He took off with more than $86,000. Once he was gone, Amy set off the alarm to bring help. Then, frantic with worry, she called home. Her mother warned her not to call police. The armed men were still there. But it was too late. She already had.
Mom, don't hang up. Mom.
The gunman checked the terrified family's bindings. It seemed like they were going to leave. But one hesitated.
Look, I'm out of here, man. Let's go.
There were 6 witnesses to the crime.
Yo, come on, man. Let's go.
At 8 p.m., Richmond County Sheriff's officers responded to the bank in Georgia and learned the real crime was across the river. The lead investigator was Kenneth Booz.
We relayed all the information that we had to the Edgefield County Sheriff's Office and told them that there was a possibility that the family was still being held hostage.
Edgefield County, South Carolina Sheriff's investigator Don Bullock got the call.
We had a family hostage situation. Respond was code 1. That's everything you got, fast as you can get there.
The family had called, saying the gunman had left, but the deputies had to be sure.
Sheriff's office, open up. Sir, step back.
The deputies checked the house for the intruders. They were gone.
They were safe. Nobody was hurt. Physically, they weren't hurt, but mentally, they had to be shattered. They really went through an ordeal.
The Shaws described the men as best they could. They never saw faces and knew only they were African-American males. The men were armed and aggressive.
Come on, man. Let's go. What you doing?
One had held a gun to Parker's head.
Look, I'm out of here, man. Let's go.
But the shot never came. When the assailants left, the family freed themselves and waited for police to arrive. Parker explained that the gunman took the keys to his son-in-law's car and described what they were wearing. Deputies put out an APB. As with any bank robbery, the Richmond County authorities notified the FBI. Special Agent Jerry Jones of the Augusta, Georgia resident agency arrived to interview Amy. She described the leader of the group and the direction in which he fled. She said she might have captured an image of him and told Special Agent Jones about the camera on the ATM.
She tried to get him into a position where the camera may take a photograph of him. As it turns out, the camera was activated only when one puts one's card into the machine, so that didn't work.
The cameras inside didn't catch him either. At the North Augusta crime scene, investigator Bullock arrived and was briefed on the search for evidence. Technicians from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division had found oily shoe prints on the garage floor and photographed them for future comparison if suspects were located. From inside the house, technicians recovered a single cartridge from the bullet fired in the living room. It was from a .38 caliber handgun, but had no prints on it. Attempts to recover the assailants' fingerprints elsewhere failed as well, since they had worn gloves throughout the crime. At the top of the driveway, investigators located a vehicle stuck in a ditch.
The 2 suspects, when they left the house, they were going to take a car, and they got the key from the victims in the house. In their haste to back out of the driveway, they backed into a ditch and could not get the car out of the ditch, so they left on foot.
The technicians recovered foreign fingerprints from the vehicle. More evidence to compare to any later suspects. Nearby, they located several items they believed had been dropped by the fleeing gunman. There were several weapons, including a shotgun and a .357 Magnum. Clothes, masks, and gloves found in the bushes matched what the assailants reportedly had worn. Without the clothes, police didn't have much of a description of the suspects. They updated the already vague APB. 3 African-American males, 2 probably on foot, 1 in a dark blue sedan, armed and considered dangerous. In 1995, South Carolina and Georgia authorities sought 3 masked men who held the Shaw family hostage and robbed a bank. Within an hour of the 911 call, an off-duty deputy was en route to the Shaw house when he heard the revised APB. He spotted 2 men, roughly fitting the description, walking away from the neighborhood where the Shaws lived.
Hey guys, let me talk to you for just a second. Where you guys coming from?
The deputy questioned the pair, according to Sheriff's investigator Don Bullock.
They asked them what they were doing there, and they said, we were up at the church playing basketball, and they had no basketball and no transportation.
Backup soon arrived. The deputies knew the church mentioned had no lights on its basketball court.
And being that time of night, it was dark. The red flags just flew up. It was, you know, he put 2 and 2 together.
If you don't mind, can we just take them back around the corner in your car since I don't have a cage? Come on, guys, we'll just clear you up real quick and that'd be not good.
The young men agreed to go to a police staging area near the Shaw house for further questioning. They were identified as Daniel Evans and Lamarco Roscoe. At the bank, FBI Special Agent Jerry Jones received word of the 2 men in custody.
I elected to leave the bank because the victim teller was comfortable and secure. So I left the bank and went over to South Carolina to interview the 2 suspects.
Jones made it to the police staging area about the same time as the suspects. He and Sheriff's investigator Kenneth Booz knew that with more than one suspect involved, it was best to talk to them separately.
We separated them because most of the time they'll start breaking down, but they'll start wondering what the other suspect has told us. When they start realizing that the other one might be talking, then they want to be the first one to get on the bandwagon and start cooperating.
The men had been unable to give details about the church where they had allegedly been playing basketball. And investigators sensed they were involved in the crime. Special Agent Jones began with Lamarco Roscoe.
You develop a concept of what their greatest fear is, some weakness they may have in their past or their family or something of that sort. And in this particular case, it was fear of the death penalty that got Roscoe's attention.
Jones knew Amy Shaw was safe, but gambled that Roscoe did not. He told him his primary concern was Amy's safety.
I told him that he needed to know that if the 3rd robber killed her, that he would face the electric chair for his complicity in the robbery. Well, everything I told him was the truth. My primary interest was the safety and welfare of the victim teller. And it is true that had the 3rd robber killed Amy Shaw, they would both have faced the death penalty.
The suspect soon admitted his involvement in the crime. When asked for the name of the leader of the group, he said he only knew him by his first name, Chris, and believed his last name started with a J.
Another law enforcement officer who was familiar with a number of ne'er-do-wells in the Augusta area recognized the name and actually asked if that was in fact Christopher Jaburk, which he replied that it was.
Jones then interviewed the second suspect, Daniel Evans.
I told him that his accomplice had already confessed, and he immediately began to tell me the story of what happened that night. I wanted him to confirm the name of the third suspect without prompting, and he immediately gave up Christopher Jaburk by name.
In talking to Roscoe and Evans, investigators realized the two were obviously the followers, and Jaburk was in charge.
They weren't the masterminds of this bank robbery. They were, in my opinion, they were mastermind stooges. They didn't appear to have much knowledge of what was going on, except for they had been with Jaburk several times in the past few days, looking at different banks, coming up with different plans on how to pull this one off.
When he was finished with the preliminary interviews, Jones learned a pager number had been recovered from one of the suspects. He asked an officer to call the number. When the return call came back, the officer identified himself. The caller said his name was Chris Jaburk. When asked, he said he was 100 miles away in Mount Vernon, Georgia. Jaburk was defensive and asked the officer if he was being accused of something. Then he hung up. Investigators headed for Jaburk's house right away.
As it turns out, law enforcement was very familiar with Christopher Jaburk and knew where the residence was without any prompting.
If he was the lead kidnapper, he now knew police were looking for him. And with a head start and $86,000 in cash, Christopher Jaburk could be anywhere. In October 1995, authorities were seeking Christopher Jaburk, wanted for armed kidnapping and bank robbery. At the request of FBI agents and Richmond County deputies, Jaburk's mother called her son on his cell phone and advised him to come talk to authorities. Around 1 a.m., he arrived with his girlfriend. Although only 19 years old, Jaburk was already on a 5-year probation for burglary and escape from a detention center. The investigators took him in for questioning.
Yeah, we would just like to verify that, standard procedure.
His girlfriend agreed to come in too. At the Sheriff's Department, FBI Special Agent Jerry Jones questioned Jaburk about the kidnapping of the Shaw family and the bank robbery in Georgia. Jaburk admitted knowing the two confessed gunmen, Daniel Evans and Lamarco Roscoe, but denied any involvement in the crime. He said he was in Mount Vernon, Georgia with his girlfriend and another female friend at the time in question.
Jaburk at first gave the two girls as his alibi, claiming to have gone with one of the girls to pick up the other girl and then come back to Augusta, Georgia, and stated that he was with the two girls the entire day, and even after they arrived back in Augusta, Georgia, they went to a movie together, all three of them.
Temporarily halting the interview, Jones went to talk to the girlfriend and the second friend who had come to the station at the request of investigators.
The two girls, when interviewed, declined to corroborate that alibi. two girls don't back up the story. That's a lie.
Jabberk quickly tried to come up with a new alibi, according to Richmond County Sheriff's investigator Kenneth Booz.
He said that he couldn't tell us his whereabouts at the time of the robbery because he was involved in some other criminal activity. It was a drug deal in Atlanta, Georgia, according to him.
Two guys named Roscoe and Abe?
Jabberk's new story didn't convince anyone. Federal authorities charged him with 6 counts, including conspiracy, carjacking, kidnapping, and armed bank robbery.
After further interviews with Jabberk, he finally started cooperating and told us that he was involved in this robbery and kidnapping, and that he was actually the one that did it, but he wasn't the mastermind, that he was involved with some large-scale criminal organization, and that he couldn't reveal any more information because he was afraid for his family.
It was another obvious lie by a man desperately trying to protect himself. Jabberk's partners, Daniel Evans and Lamarco Roscoe, pleaded guilty to state charges of burglary, kidnapping, and armed robbery. They were sentenced to 30 years in prison. Christopher Jabberk was prosecuted by Assistant U.S. Attorney Richard Goolsby.
The only problem with this case was that there was no scientific evidence. It seemed like we hit a dead end every time we got a lab report as to any fingerprints or footprints. None of them matched Jabberk. But in terms of the quality of the evidence, we were very fortunate that the teller victim and her family members were just incredibly good witnesses. They helped win the case.
Jabberk was convicted on all 6 counts, which made him eligible for a sentence of life in prison without parole. While awaiting sentencing, Jabberk was held at a small county jail. There, he met another inmate. Jerome Frierson Bay, also a bank robber, was awaiting trial on 3 armed robberies. At the time, the jail was undergoing construction to expand the facility.
That's that one guard out that door.
There was plenty of time to plan an escape.
Yeah, I think I see man right around noon or whatnot.
On March 27th, 1996, a guard on routine patrol noticed an open door. A head count revealed 2 inmates were missing: Christopher Jabberk and Jerome Frierson Bay. Construction workers had seen 2 prisoners running toward a wooded area near the prison. Search teams combed the woods, but no one spotted the men. The search moved into the area's denser forest and swamps. And helicopters flew grid patterns overhead. Still, nothing. Authorities believe the pair might have had help on the outside. Police tried to seal the perimeter, putting up roadblocks to stop and check vehicles. But the 2 escapees were nowhere to be found. Jabberk's escape posed a danger to the Shaw family, who had testified at his trial.
We needed to contact the victim's family members and let them know about it, and to take other precautions that you would in a situation like this.
While the search continued, Edgefield County, South Carolina deputies began spot checks on the Shaw family to make sure they were safe.
I was convinced that at some point in time, he would come back to the mother. we established a surveillance, 24-hour surveillance of the mother and the girlfriend.
Authorities watched, but Jaburk never showed. Then, FBI Special Agent Doug Fender developed a surprising lead.
Myself and other local law enforcement officials were conducting a separate auto theft investigation in the Augusta, Georgia area concerning the theft of a green Mitsubishi Eclipse. We were able to identify an individual in jail who indicated that he had transferred this stolen vehicle to one of the female associates of Jaburk.
Agents interviewed the young woman at the hotel where she worked. Initially, she denied any knowledge of the jailbreak, but Special Agent Fender tried to get her to cooperate.
This job is mainly about talking to people. When you put all the fancy forensic techniques and those sorts of things aside, probably the success of most agents is based upon their ability to solicit information from individuals and make them tell them something that they probably don't want to share with you.
When she realized she herself could go to jail, she admitted helping in the escape. She said that she and Jaburk's girlfriend delivered a stolen car to a parking lot near a wooded area by the prison.
After he escaped from the jail, he just got into the getaway car and made his escape with Frierson Bay. They, by prearrangement, went to a clandestine campsite which the girls had laid out for Jaburk and Frierson Bay with clothes and water and that type of thing.
The escapees easily found the stashed clothes, food, and weapons. They were free, but they needed money. The armed bank robbers knew exactly what to do. In 1996, escaped prisoners Christopher Jaburk and Jerome Frierson Bay fled a county jail in a stolen car. FBI Special Agent Jerry Jones was after them.
We began a search for the stolen vehicle, and we sent out an APB to all surrounding states regarding the description of the vehicle.
The day after the escape, a car matching that description pulled up to a bank in Lumberton, North Carolina, 220 miles northeast of the jail.
That's right, just take the money.
Two men in hats, gloves, and sunglasses robbed the bank at gunpoint. The employees knew to cooperate, so no one would get hurt.
Come on, man, let's go.
Lumberton police and North Carolina FBI agents responded to the scene. They determined $4,500 had been taken from the bank's vault. Security cameras were rolling during the robbery. The images were too blurry to make out faces, but the descriptions given by employees resembled Jaburk and Frierson Bay. And the car they left in matched the one the fugitives had.
I'll be there. Thanks.
The car was the best lead for Special Agent Doug Fender.
This vehicle we had entered into NCIC, and we discovered or was notified by the Lumberton police officials that that car had in fact been recovered in Lumberton, North Carolina.
An hour after that car was found, agents received a report of a home invasion and carjacking in Lumberton and went to interview the victims. The couple said they had been working on their car in the garage when two armed men burst in, demanding the keys to the car and a change of clothes. then left as quickly as they had arrived. When shown a photo lineup, the couple positively identified Jaburk and Frierson Bay.
And that's the guy that came up on the left side.
So we had a second vehicle, and we had an APB put out on that car. It was spotted in Raleigh, North Carolina. Jaburk and Frierson Bay robbed a bank there.
The fugitives were heading north, fast.
We knew that Frierson Bay had relatives in the New York, New Jersey area, so we suspected that to be the ultimate destination.
Tracking the pair became a matter of following a trail of bank robberies.
What we noticed was a trend of bank robberies that were occurring up and down the I-95 corridor. At the time we were tracking Frierson Bay and Jaburk, we suspected them in approximately 11 to 14 bank robberies up and down the East Coast.
In some of the robberies, men matching the description of one or both of the fugitives were captured on surveillance video.
We were able, through photographic surveillance and also witness identification, to establish that the two of them were together at least until they reached the Fredericksburg, Virginia area.
Agents focused their search in New Jersey, where Frierson Bay had family.
Based upon 2 tips that were called into a nationally televised program, Frierson Bay was tracked to a motel located in the Paterson, New Jersey area. A surveillance by members of the New Jersey FBI office was established. Once these agents were able to establish that Frierson Bay might be staying in the motel room, they remained on the premises.
If he were inside and armed, approaching the door would be dangerous. It was decided to wait him out. Soon they would learn the fugitive would not go down without a struggle. After 2 escaped prisoners committed a string of armed bank robberies, agents believed they had tracked one of them, Jerome Frierson Bay, to a New Jersey motel. After several hours, they spotted the fugitive. He went to his car as the SWAT team moved in.
Police, get out of the car! Get out of the car! We see your hands! Get out of the car!
He locked himself inside. But that wasn't going to stop them, according to FBI Special Agent Doug Fender.
After several commands by members of the FBI SWAT team, Frierson Bay still refused to come out of the vehicle, at which time one of the SWAT team members was able to break the glass with the butt of his MP5 submachine gun. Frierson Bay was then forcibly removed from the vehicle.
From his car, the SWAT team recovered a loaded .40 caliber Glock semi-automatic handgun, along with $1,500 in stolen cash. A search of the motel revealed no sign of his partner, Christopher Jaburk. Jerome Frierson Bay pleaded guilty to 10 bank robberies and was sentenced to 19 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He claimed he had no idea where Jaburk was. Finding Christopher Jaburk remained a priority for Georgia FBI Special Agent Jerry Jones.
We believe that Jaburk and Frierson Bay parted company, and Jaburk began his journey back to Georgia. I always believed that Jaburk would come back home.
The FBI announced a $10,000 reward and had begun the process of adding him to their 10 most wanted fugitives list when a media report generated a promising lead.
Just a moment.
A caller said she believed the fugitive was staying with her minister in Atlanta, though the minister didn't know Jaburk was a criminal. The caller spotted Jaburk when she went to check on the minister's house after the elderly man entered the hospital with heart trouble. An arrest team staked out the residence, dressed as yard workers. On May 9th, 1996, a vehicle pulled into the minister's driveway. When the driver emerged, agents visually identified him.
What's going on?
It was Jaburk.
Finishing up the yard work for the old man?
The arrest team moved in.
Hands up, FBI! Hands up! Hands up! Hey, whoa, what's going on?
Surprised and cornered, Jaburk did not try to run. When they searched him, agents found $2,000 in his sock.
Hey! What's this? What is it? What you hey for? What is this?
He was returned to jail, again to await sentencing for the Augusta kidnapping bank robbery.
When Jaburk was apprehended in Atlanta, we thought the pressure was off and everybody took a big sigh of relief and went home for a short period of time.
Jaburk was not giving up. Six weeks after his recapture, he once again broke out of his cell.
When Jaburk escaped and I received the telephone call, I responded to the jail to try to secure whatever evidence was there. We found a partial saw blade. When he got through the window of the jail, there's a huge double fence around the confinement area covered with concertina wire. So he had to get over that fence and over the concertina wire.
Agents searched the grounds and the fence topped with a razor-sharp wire. They recovered shreds of a prison uniform.
And we actually found traces of blood there, so we knew he was injured, but he was on foot.
They hoped he hadn't gotten far.
So we began to trail him through this rural wooded area, which also leads to a swampy area, probably around 10 square miles. We immediately brought in tracking dogs, which led us directly to the wooded area. So we knew the route of escape that he was trying to accomplish. As old as I was, out with the younger people going through the woods, and we tracked through there for days, for several days, without finding him. I then decided that we needed some electronic gear to try to trace him. So I contacted the Atomic Energy Commission site over in South Carolina, and they provided me with a helicopter equipped with an infrared system that's a heat-seeking system.
They searched dozens of square miles with the highly sensitive equipment. But somehow, Jaburk managed to avoid detection and was still on the run. Four days later, an off-duty sheriff's deputy in nearby Appling, Georgia, thought he spotted the fugitive. The man was limping as if injured. The deputy called the station, and other officers spread out to search the area.
He was tracked into a wooded area right behind one of the grammar schools and apprehended.
Right there. Hands up.
Christopher Jaburk was again in custody. 2 weeks later, he was finally sentenced for robbing the Augusta Bank and kidnapping Amy Shaw and her family. Assistant U.S. Attorney Richard Goolsby fought to keep Jaburk off the streets forever.
Our role is to try to protect the community. That's one of our important responsibilities. So we were concerned and felt like that we should ask for the maximum in Jaburk's case. And fortunately, the court imposed the maximum, life in prison, plus 5 years.
Jaburk was ordered to serve his term at the federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. Without the possibility of parole, his only chance to be free again would be to escape. Several weeks into his sentence, Jaburk was caught trying to do exactly that by hanging on underneath a prison laundry truck.
Come on out now. Come on. Nice and slow. Come on, man. I see you. Come on. Nice and slow. Come on. Get out of there.
He had almost made it to the front gate. Jaburk was transferred to the maximum security federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia.
Even if Harry Houdini was in the Atlanta federal pen, he wouldn't be able to get out, and Christopher Jaburk is no Harry Houdini.
No one doubts Jaburk will try again. But now, he is held in one of the most secure prisons in America.